In December of 1972, in the dark skies over North Vietnam, something began to happen that many people on the ground would later describe not as an air attack, but as a natural disaster, because before the first explosion was even heard, the air itself started to feel heavy, the night seemed to vibrate, and then a low distant rumble began to roll across the land, growing louder and louder until it felt like the sky was cracking open, and that was the moment people realized that the B-52 bombers were coming, bringing with them a kind of destruction that no bunker, no trench, and no building could truly escape. The B-52 Stratofortress was not a sleek fighter jet or a fast-moving tactical aircraft, it was a massive flying fortress, a giant of the skies designed to carry enormous loads of bombs over vast distances, and when it entered a war zone, it did not come to hit one target, it came to cover entire areas in fire and shock, turning landscapes into fields of craters and rubble in a matter of minutes. And during Operation Linebacker II, this terrifying ability was unleashed over Hanoi and other key North Vietnamese cities with a level of intensity the world had rarely seen. For the people on the ground, the experience was overwhelming, because carpet bombing was not about precision strikes or isolated explosions, it was about waves of bombs falling one after another, spreading out across neighborhoods, industrial zones, and military positions, creating a continuous roar that shook the earth, shattered windows, collapsed walls, and sent shockwaves through underground shelters, making even the deepest bunkers feel like they might cave in at any moment, and that is why so many survivors would later say that it felt less like being attacked by planes and more like being trapped inside a massive earthquake. What made this even more terrifying was the scale of the B-52 formations, because these bombers did not fly alone, they came in groups, often dozens at a time, each one carrying tons of explosives, and when they released their payloads in coordinated patterns, the bombs would rain down across entire sections of a city or battlefield, creating a wall of destruction that moved steadily across the landscape, leaving nothing untouched in its path, and this was not just a physical assault, it was a psychological one, designed to overwhelm, intimidate, and break the will of anyone who was trying to hold out against it. Inside North Vietnam's air defense network, the arrival of the B-52s created a sense of urgent dread, because while they had dealt with American aircraft before, nothing quite compared to the sheer size, altitude, and bomb-carrying capacity of these giants, and even when surface-to-air missiles were fired and anti-aircraft guns lit up the sky, the bombers kept coming, flying straight through the danger to deliver their devastating payloads, and this gave them an almost unstoppable reputation. As if nothing short of luck could prevent them from reaching their targets. For American crews, flying a B-52 during these missions was a tense and dangerous experience, because even though they were far above the ground, they knew they were the focus of every missile and radar system in the region, and yet they also understood the importance of what they were doing, because the entire strategy of Linebacker II depended on their ability to apply overwhelming pressure, forcing North Vietnam's leadership to the negotiating table by showing that no place was truly beyond reach. This is where our story begins, not with a single bomb or a single plane, but with a new kind of warfare, one where the sky itself became a weapon, and where the ground shook not because of earthquakes, but because of machines built to bring entire landscapes to their knees, and in the next part, we are going to take a closer look at the B-52 itself, how it was built, why it was so powerful, and how it became the centerpiece of one of the most intense bombing campaigns in modern history. So if this opening already has you hooked, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because this story of fire, fear, and flying fortresses is only just getting started. The B-52 Stratofortress was not created for Vietnam, and it was not even created for conventional wars in Asia or Europe, because when it was first designed in the early years of the Cold War, its original purpose was to fly across oceans and continents carrying nuclear weapons deep into enemy territory, and that means everything about this aircraft was built for endurance, altitude, and overwhelming payload rather than speed or agility, turning it into something more like a flying aircraft carrier than a normal bomber. With a wingspan wider than a football field and the ability to carry tens of thousands of pounds of bombs, the B-52 could stay in the air for extremely long periods, refuel in midair, and strike targets thousands of miles from where it took off, and this is exactly why it became such a powerful tool in the Vietnam War. Because it allowed the United States to deliver massive amounts of explosives over distant targets with relentless consistency, day after day, night after night, creating pressure that could not be easily escaped. What made the B-52 especially terrifying in carpet bombing missions was the way its bomb bays and external racks were designed, because instead of dropping just a few weapons, it could release huge patterns of bombs in carefully planned sequences, covering wide rectangular areas on the ground, and when multiple B-52s released their loads one after another, these patterns overlapped, turning entire districts into destruction zones where nothing remained intact, and this method was brutally efficient, not because it was precise, but because it was simply overwhelming. From the perspective of military planners, this was exactly the point, because the goal was not to hit a single building or a single factory, but to crush supply lines, disrupt troop movements, and shatter morale by making it impossible to safely gather forces or operate large facilities in the open, and when B-52 strikes hit areas near Hanoi and Haiphong, they were meant to send a message that even the most important political and industrial centers were vulnerable. Yet inside the cockpit, the experience was strangely detached, because B-52 crews flew high above the clouds, often unable to see the explosions they were causing, relying instead on instruments, radar, and mission reports to know where their bombs were falling, and this created a surreal contrast between the calm, controlled environment inside the aircraft and the chaos unfolding far below, where entire neighborhoods were being shaken apart by wave after wave of detonations. The North Vietnamese understood that they could not allow these bombers to operate freely, and so they built one of the most intense air defense networks the world had ever seen, filled with radar stations, missile batteries, and anti-aircraft guns, all focused on tracking and destroying the incoming B-52 formations, and this turned the skies over Hanoi into one of the most dangerous airspaces on Earth, where every mission became a deadly contest between technology, training, and sheer determination. This set the stage for a dramatic clash, because the B-52s represented the peak of American aerial firepower, while the North Vietnamese defenses represented one of the most sophisticated attempts ever made to bring those giants down, and in the next part, we are going to step into that battle, looking at how missiles, radar, and tactics collided with these massive bombers in a struggle that would decide the fate of Operation Linebacker II. And before we continue, take a moment to drop a comment about what surprised you the most so far, and don't forget to like and subscribe, because this story is about to get even more intense. By December of 1972, the skies over North Vietnam had become one of the most heavily defended airspaces in human history, because years of American airstrikes had forced the North Vietnamese to build layer after layer of air defense systems designed specifically to hunt and kill large bombers, and at the center of this deadly web were Soviet-supplied SA-2 surface-to-air missiles, massive radar-guided weapons that could reach altitudes where even the B-52 usually felt safe, turning what had once been a protected cruising height into a zone of constant danger. These missiles were not fired randomly, because the North Vietnamese operators had become extremely skilled at tracking incoming aircraft, reading radar screens, calculating flight paths, and launching their weapons at the exact moment when a B-52 formation was most vulnerable, and when an SA-2 was launched, it left behind a thick white trail of smoke that curved upward through the sky, a terrifying signal to the bomber crews that a deadly machine was now racing toward them at several times the speed of sound. Inside the B-52s, electronic warfare officers monitored warning systems that screamed when a missile radar locked onto them, and pilots were trained to perform specific maneuvers and deploy electronic countermeasures in an attempt to confuse the guidance systems of the incoming missiles. But because the B-52 was such a large and relatively slow aircraft, it could not dodge the way a fighter jet could, meaning that survival often depended on technology and timing rather than agility. When missiles exploded near a bomber, the shock waves could rip apart control surfaces, damage engines, or send fragments of metal tearing through the fuselage, and several B-52s were lost during these missions, with crews forced to eject over enemy territory or disappearing into the night, and each loss sent a powerful signal to both sides, showing that even the most powerful bomber in the world was not invincible. Yet despite these dangers, the missions continued, because Operation Linebacker II was not designed to be cautious, it was designed to be overwhelming, and wave after wave of B-52s flew into the storm of missiles and flak, dropping their bomb loads on targets around Hanoi and Haiphong, slowly grinding down the North Vietnamese air defenses through sheer persistence. The defenders were firing so many missiles that some batteries began to run low on ammunition, while American planners studied the patterns of launches and adapted their flight paths to reduce losses, turning the air war into a kind of deadly chess match played at 30,000 feet, where every move and counter-move could mean the difference between survival and destruction. And as this battle in the sky raged on, the ground below continued to shake, as entire areas were pounded into rubble by the endless rain of bombs, creating a situation where pressure was coming from both above and below, pushing the North Vietnamese leadership toward a breaking point that would soon change the course of the war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of the most intense air campaigns in history, make sure to hit like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments if you would have wanted to fly an B-52 or if that thought alone makes your hands sweat. As the nights of Operation Linebacker II continued, something remarkable began to happen across North Vietnam, because the sheer scale of the B-52 carpet bombing started to physically reshape entire regions, turning industrial zones, rail yards, power plants, and military storage areas into fields of twisted metal and smoking craters, and this destruction was not just dramatic, it was systematic, because American planners had carefully selected targets that were critical to the war effort. Meaning that every explosion had a purpose even when it looked like pure chaos from the outside. Rail lines that once moved troops and supplies from China into Vietnam were cut again and again, forcing the North Vietnamese to rely on slower, more dangerous transportation methods, while fuel depots went up in massive fireballs that could be seen from miles away, and communications centers were knocked offline, creating confusion and delays that rippled through the entire military structure. And all of this meant that the ability to coordinate and sustain the war was being steadily eroded. For the people on the ground, the experience was something close to apocalyptic, because B-52 strikes did not arrive as a single explosion, but as a rolling wave of destruction that could last several minutes, with bomb after bomb slamming into the earth, each one shaking buildings, collapsing walls, and sending shockwaves through the air that made it hard to breathe or even stand. And survivors later described the sound as something that felt less like noise and more like the sky itself tearing apart. This psychological effect was one of the most powerful weapons the B-52 carried, because even hardened soldiers found it nearly impossible to operate under that kind of pressure, and units that might have been willing to fight under artillery fire or airstrikes from smaller aircraft often abandoned their positions when they knew a carpet bombing was coming, understanding that there was no safe place to hide when hundreds of tons of explosives were about to fall. At the same time, the North Vietnamese leadership was watching the destruction pile up, knowing that every destroyed factory and every shattered rail yard made it harder to continue the war, and while they had endured years of bombing before, the intensity of Linebacker II was on another level entirely, forcing them to calculate how long they could realistically hold out before the damage became irreversible. And yet, even as the pressure mounted, the air defense crews kept firing, risking their lives to shoot down as many bombers as possible, because every B-52 destroyed was not just a tactical victory, it was a powerful symbol that resistance was still possible, turning the air war into a brutal test of endurance on both sides. As this deadly balance continued, one question hung in the air like a storm cloud: would the destruction force a political breakthrough, or would it simply deepen the resolve of those on the ground? And in the next part, we will see how that question was answered in one of the most dramatic moments of the entire Vietnam War. If you're finding this story gripping, drop a comment and let us know what you think about the strategy behind carpet bombing, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. As the bombing continued into its final days, the international reaction began to grow just as intense as the explosions themselves, because the scale of the B-52 attacks over North Vietnam was impossible to ignore, and images of shattered buildings, burning cities, and desperate civilians spread across the world, fueling debates, protests, and political pressure in countries far beyond Southeast Asia, turning Operation Linebacker II into not just a military campaign, but a global event. Inside North Vietnam, however, the reality was brutally practical, because every destroyed bridge and every ruined power station meant more difficulty keeping the war machine running, and even as leaders tried to project confidence, they knew that the sustained pounding from the air was pushing their infrastructure toward collapse. forcing them to make hard choices about where to allocate their limited resources and how much more punishment they could realistically endure. Meanwhile, American bomber crews continued to fly night after night, dealing with exhaustion, fear, and the constant awareness that a missile could end their mission at any moment, and yet they also knew that what they were doing was having a real impact, because intelligence reports showed that key targets were being knocked out faster than they could be repaired, slowly squeezing the ability of North Vietnam to keep fighting at full strength. This created a strange and powerful tension, because while the political world debated the morality and consequences of the bombing, the military reality on the ground and in the air was that the pressure was working, and by late December, signals began to emerge that the North Vietnamese were more willing to return to negotiations, suggesting that the relentless carpet bombing had achieved at least part of its intended effect. When the bombing finally paused, it was not because the B-52s had run out of bombs or because the air defenses had stopped fighting, but because the strategic objective had been reached and talks resumed in Paris, opening the door to agreements that would soon lead to the end of direct American involvement in the war. Yet even as diplomats shook hands and signed papers, the echoes of the B-52 strikes lingered, because the physical and psychological scars left by those nights of bombing could not simply be erased, shaping how the war would be remembered and how future conflicts would be fought. In the final part, we are going to look at what this campaign meant in the long run, for both the United States and Vietnam, and how the B-52 earned its place as one of the most feared and influential aircraft in military history. If you've made it this far, you're already part of the story, so hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments about whether you think this kind of overwhelming air power can really decide a war. When historians look back at Operation Linebacker II, they often describe it as one of the most concentrated uses of strategic bombing in modern warfare, because in just a few short weeks, the B-52 fleet delivered more explosive power than many entire campaigns had managed in years, and this sheer intensity permanently changed how military planners thought about air power, showing that even in an age of missiles and air defenses, a massive bomber force could still impose its will on a battlefield through persistence, coordination, and overwhelming force. For the United States, the campaign was both a demonstration of technological superiority and a painful reminder of the human cost of war, because while the B-52s proved they could reach almost any target on Earth and destroy it with terrifying efficiency, they also revealed the limits of what bombing alone could achieve, since even after the ground had been shaken and negotiations had resumed, the deeper political and social forces driving the conflict remained unresolved, leaving a complex and sometimes uncomfortable legacy. In Vietnam, the memory of the Christmas bombings became a defining chapter of the war, one that symbolized both the devastation of modern warfare and the resilience of a nation under extreme pressure, because even after entire districts were flattened and critical infrastructure was destroyed, the country continued to rebuild and adapt, turning destruction into determination in a way that still shapes Vietnamese identity today. The B-52 itself, however, went on to have a career far beyond Vietnam, flying in conflicts from the Middle East to Eastern Europe, dropping precision-guided weapons as well as traditional bombs, and proving that a design born in the early days of the Cold War could still be relevant decades later, making it one of the longest-serving combat aircraft in history and a true icon of American air power. And maybe that is the most important lesson of all, because the story of the B-52 is not just about bombs and explosions, but about how technology, strategy, and human decisions combine to create moments that reshape the world, sometimes in ways no one could have fully predicted when those massive wings first lifted off the runway. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the aircraft that made the ground shake and changed the course of a war, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more true military history, and leave a comment telling us which machine of war you want us to explore next, because there are still many stories waiting to be told. Long after the last B-52 turned back toward its base and the final explosions faded into distant thunder, something invisible but powerful remained hanging over Vietnam, because the memory of those nights when the sky rained fire had become part of the psychological landscape of the war, shaping how soldiers, civilians, and leaders thought about what modern air power truly meant, and for many who lived through it, the sound of those bombers was never forgotten, not because it was just loud, but because it represented a moment when technology made human will feel almost powerless. For American crews, those missions became some of the most intense experiences of their lives, because flying into the heart of one of the most heavily defended airspaces in the world in a slow, massive aircraft required a level of discipline and courage that is difficult to fully describe, and every time a missile warning went off, every time a shockwave rocked the fuselage, they knew that history was being written in real time, one flight at a time. The B-52 had been designed to deliver nuclear weapons at the end of the world, but in Vietnam, it became something different, a tool of conventional destruction on a scale few could imagine, proving that even without nuclear warheads, it could still alter the balance of a conflict simply by making entire regions unlivable for organized military activity. And that realization changed how wars would be planned for generations. After Vietnam, no nation ever again underestimated the power of strategic bombing, and no enemy ever looked at a formation of heavy bombers the same way, because the lesson had been learned in the most brutal way possible, that when machines like the B-52 are unleashed in full force, they do not just destroy targets, they reshape reality itself, turning geography, infrastructure, and morale into something fragile and temporary. And yet, history also showed something equally powerful, because even after the ground had been shattered and cities reduced to rubble, human beings still found ways to rebuild, to remember, and to keep moving forward, reminding us that while machines can shake the earth, they cannot fully control the human spirit, and that tension between destruction and resilience is what makes stories like this one so unforgettable. So when people today talk about the B-52, they are not just talking about an airplane, they are talking about an era, a strategy, and a moment when the sky itself became a weapon, and the echoes of those bombing runs still ripple through military thinking and global politics even now. If this story made you see air power in a new way, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more true war history, and tell us in the comments which legendary machine or battle you want to hear about next, because every machine has a story, and some of them changed the world forever.